Cahira from the Weaves of the Wheel community on Instagram. I'm going door to door as part of our Weaves of the Wheel read-along. Do you have time for me to read you a chapter from the Eye of the World? Great. So at the end of chapter 13, we see the party from Emmons Field arriving at Berlon. They spend some time talking to the gatekeeper before making their way to the inn. And they finally have arrived at the inn, and this is where chapter 14 picks up. So chapter 14 is called The Stag and Lion, and we'll get right into it. Inside, the inn was every bit as busy as the sounds coming from it had indicated and more. The party from Emmons Field followed Master Fitch through the back door, soon weaving around and between a constant stream of men and women in long aprons, platters of food, and trays of drink held high. The bearers murmured quick apologies when they got in anyone's way, but they never slowed by a step. One of the men took hurried orders from Master Fitch and disappeared at a run. The inn is near full, I'm afraid, the innkeeper told Moraine, almost to the rafters. Every inn in the town is the same. With the winter we've just had, well, as soon as it cleared enough for them to get down out of the mountains, we were inundated. Yes, that's the word, inundated, by men from the mines and smelters, all telling the most horrible tale, wolves and worse, the kind of tales men tell when they've been cooped up all winter. I can't think there's anyone left up there at all. We have that many here. But never fear, things may be a little crowded, but I'll do my best by you and Master Andra, and your friends too, of course. He glanced curiously once or twice at Rand and the others. Except for Tom, their clothes named them country folk, and Tom's gleaming cloak made him a strange traveling companion for Mistress Alice and Master Andra. I will do my best, you may rest assured. Rand stared at the bustle around them and tried to avoid being stepped on, though none of the help really seemed to be in any danger of that. He kept thinking of how Master Alvere and his wife tended the Wine Spring Inn with sometimes a little assistance from their daughters. Matt and Perrin craned their necks in interest towards the common room, from which rolled a wave of laughter and singing and jovial shouting whenever the wide door at the end of the hall swung open. Muttering about finding out the news, the warder grimly disappeared through that swinging door, swallowed by a wave of merriment. Rand wanted to follow him, but he wanted a bath even more. He could have done with people and laughing right then, but the common room would appreciate his presence more when he was clean. Matt and Perrin apparently felt the same. Matt was scratching surreptitiously. Master Fitch, Moraine said, I understand there are children of the light in Berlon. Is there likely to be trouble? Oh, never you worry about them, Mistress Alice. They're up to their usual tricks. Claim there's an Aes Sedai in the town. Moraine lifted an eyebrow, and the innkeeper spread his plump hands. Don't you worry. They've got it before. They've tried it before. There's no Aes Sedai in Berlon, and the governor knows it. The White Cloaks think if they show an Aes Sedai, some women they claim as an Aes Sedai, people will let all of them inside the walls. Well, I suppose some would. But most people know that the White Cloaks are up to, and they support the governor. No one wants to see some harmless old woman hurt just so the children can have an excuse for whipping up a frenzy. I am glad to hear it, Moraine said dryly. She put a hand on the innkeeper's arm. Is Min still here? I wish to talk with her if she is. Master Fitch's answer was lost to Rand in the arrival of attendants to lead them to the baths. Moraine and Egwene vanished behind a plump woman with a ready smile and an armload of towels. The Gleeman and Rand and his friends found themselves following a slight, dark-haired fellow, Ara by the name. Rand tried asking Ara about Berlon, but the man barely said 2 words together, except to say Rand had a funny accent, and the first sight of the bath chamber drove all thoughts of talk right out of Rand's head. A dozen tall copper bathtubs sat in a circle on the tiled floor, which sloped down slightly to a drain in the center of the big stone-walled room. A thick towel, neatly folded, in a large cake of yellow soap sat on a stool behind each tub, and big black iron cauldrons of water stood heating over fires along one wall. On the opposite wall, logs blazing in a deep fireplace added to the general warmth. Almost as good as the Wine Spring Inn back home, Perrin said loyally, if not exactly with a great attention to truth. Tom barked a laugh, and Matt sniggered. Sounds like we brought a Copland with us and didn't know it. Rand shrugged out of his cloak and stripped off his clothes while Ara filled 4 of the copper tubs. None of the others was far behind Rand in choosing a bathtub. Once their clothes were all in piles on the stools, Ara brought them each a large bucket of hot water and a dipper. That done, he sat on a stool by the door, leaning back against the wall with his arms crossed, apparently lost in his own thoughts. There was little in the way of conversation while they lathered and sluiced away a week of grime with dippers of steaming water. Then it was into the hot tubs for a long soak. Ara had made the water hot enough that settling in was a slow process of luxuriant sighs. The air in the room went from warm to misty and hot. For a long time there was no sound except the occasional long, relaxing exhalation as tight muscles loosened and a chill that they had come to think permanent was drawn out of their bones. Need anything else? Ara asked suddenly. He did not have much room to talk about people's accents. He and Master Fitch both sounded as if they had a mouthful of mush. More towels? More hot water? Nothing, Tom said in his reverberant voice. Eyes closed, he gave an indolent wave of his hand. Go and enjoy the evening. At a later time, I will see that you receive more than adequate recompense for your services. He settled lower in the tub until the water covered everything but his eyes and nose. Ara's eyes went to the stools behind the tubs, where their clothes and belongings were stacked. He glanced at the bow, but lingered longest over Rand's sword and Perrin's axe. Is there trouble down country too? He said abruptly. In the rivers, or whatever you call it? The 2 rivers, Matt said, pronouncing each separate word distinctly. It's the 2 rivers. As for trouble, why... What do you mean, 2? Rand asked. Is there some kind of trouble here? Perrin, enjoying his soak, murmured, Good, good. Tom raised himself back up a little and opened his eyes. Here, Ara snorted. Trouble? Miners having fistfights in the street in the dark of the morning aren't trouble. Or... He stopped and eyed them a moment. I meant the Gildan kind of trouble, he said finally. No, I suppose not. Nothing but sheep down country, is there? No offense. I just meant it's quiet down there. Still, it's been a strange winter. Strange things in the mountains. I heard the other day that there were Trollocs up in Saldea, but that's the borderlands then, isn't it? He finished with his mouth still open, then snapped it shut, appearing surprised that he had said so much. Rand had tensed at the word Trollocs, and tried to hide it by wringing his washcloth out over his head. As the fellow went on, he relaxed, but not everyone kept his mouth shut. Trollocs? Matt chortled. Rand splashed water at him, but Matt just wiped it off his face with a grin. You just let me tell you about Trollocs. For the first time since climbing into his tub, Tom spoke. Why don't you not? I'm a little tired of hearing my own stories back from you. He's a gleeman, Perrin said, and Ara gave him a scornful look. I saw the cloak. You going to perform? Just a minute, Matt protested. What's this about me telling Tom stories? Are you all... You just don't tell them as well as Tom, Rand cut him off hastily, and Perrin hopped in. You keep adding in things, trying to make it better, and they never do. And you get it all mixed up, too, Rand added. Best leave it to Tom. They were all talking so fast that Ara stared at them with his mouth hanging open. Matt stared, too, as if everyone else had suddenly gone crazy. Rand wondered how to shut him up short of jumping on him. The door banged open to admit Lan, brown cloak slung over one shoulder, along with a gust of cooler air that momentarily thinned the mist. Well, the warder said, rubbing his hands, this is what I've been waiting for. Ara picked up a bucket, but Lan waved it away. No, I will see to myself. Dropping his cloak on one of the stools, he bundled the bath attendant out of the room, despite the fellow's protests, and shut the door firmly behind him. He waited there a moment, his head cocked to listen, and when he turned back to the rest of them, his voice was stony and his eyes stabbed at Matt. "It's a good thing I got back when I did, farm boy. Don't you listen to what you're told?" "I didn't do anything," Matt protested. "I was just going to tell him about the Trollocs, not about—" He stopped and leaned back from the warder's eyes, flat against the back of the tub. "Don't talk about Trollocs," Lance said grimly. "Don't even think about Trollocs." With an angry snort, he began filling himself a bathtub. "Blood and ashes, you had better remember. The Dark One has eyes and ears where you least expect. And if the Children of the Light here Trollocs were after you, they'd be burning to get their hands on you. To them, it would be as much as naming you Dark Friend. It may not be what you're used to, but until we get where we are going, keep your trust small unless Mistress Alice or I tell you differently." At his emphasis on the name Moraine was using, Matt flinched. "There was something that fellow wouldn't tell us," Rand said. "Something he thought was trouble, but he wouldn't say what it was." "Probably the children," Lance said, pouring hot water into his tub. "Most people consider them trouble. Some don't, though, and he did not know you well enough to risk it. You might have gone running to the White Cloaks for all he knew." Rand shook his head. This place already sounded worse than Tarn Ferry could possibly be. "He said there were Trollocs in Saldea, wasn't it?" Perrin said. Land hurled the empty bucket to the floor with a crash. "You will talk about it, won't you? There are always Trollocs in the borderlands, blacksmith. Just you put it in the front of your mind that we want no more attention than mice in a field. Concentrate on that. Moraine wants to get you all to Tarvalon alive, and I will do it if it can be done. But if you bring any harm to her—" The rest of their bathing was done in silence, and dressing afterwards, too. When they left the bath chamber, Moraine was standing at the end of the hall with a slender girl not much taller than herself. At least, Rand thought it was a girl, though her dark hair was cut short and she wore a man's shirt and trousers. Moraine said something, and the girl looked at the men sharply, then nodded to Moraine and hurried away. "Well now," Moraine said as they drew closer, "I am sure Bath has given you all an appetite. Master Fitch has given us a private dining room." She talked on inconsequentially as she turned to lead the way, about their rooms and the crowding in the town, and how the innkeeper hoped Tom would favor the common room with some music and a story or two. She never mentioned the girl, if girl it had been. The private dining room had a polished oak table with a dozen chairs around it and a thick rug on the floor. As they entered, Egwene, freshly gleaming hair combed out around her shoulders, turned from warming her hands at the fire crackling on the hearth. Rand had had plenty of time for thought during the long silence in the bath chamber. Land's constant admonitions not to trust anyone, and especially Ara being afraid to trust them, had made him think of just how alone they really were. It seemed as if they could not trust anyone but themselves, and he was still not too sure how far they could trust Moraine or Lan, just themselves. And Egwene was still Egwene. Moraine said it would have happened to her anyway, this touching the true source. She had no control over it, and that meant it was not her fault. And she was still Egwene. He opened his mouth to apologize, but Egwene stiffened and turned her back before he could get a word out. Staring sullenly at her back, he swallowed what he had been going to say. "All right, then. If she wants to be like that, there's nothing I can do." Master Fitch bustled in then, followed by 4 women in white aprons as long as his, with a platter holding 3 roast chickens and others bearing silver and pottery dishes and covered bowls. The women began setting the table immediately, while the innkeeper bowed to Moraine. "My apologies, Mistress Alice, for making you wait like this, but with so many people in the inn, it's a wonder anybody gets served at all. I'm afraid the food isn't what it should be either. Just the chickens and some turnips and hen peas, with a little cheese for after. No, it just isn't what it should be. I truly do apologize." "A feast," Moraine smiled. "For these troubled times, a feast indeed, Master Fitch." The innkeeper bowed again, his wispy hair sticking out in all directions as if he constantly ran his hands through it, made the bow comical. but his grin was so pleasant that anyone who laughed would be laughing with him, not at him. "My thanks, Mistress Alice, my thanks." As he straightened, he frowned and wiped an imagined bit of dust from the table with the corner of his apron. "It isn't what I would have laid before you a year ago, of course. Not nearly. The winter, yes, the winter. My cellars are emptying out, and the market is all but bare. And who can blame the farm folk? Who? There's certainly no telling when they'll harvest another crop. No telling at all. It's the wolves get the mutton and beef that should go on people's tables, and..." Abruptly, he seemed to realize that this was hardly the conversation to settle his guest to a comfortable meal. "How I do run on. Full of old wind, that's me. Old wind. Mari, Cinda, let these good people eat in peace." He made shooing gestures at the women, and as they scurried from the room, swung back to bow to Moraine yet again. "I hope you enjoy your meal, Mistress Alice. If there's anything else you need, just speak it, and I will fetch it. Just you speak it. It's a pleasure serving you and Master Andra. A pleasure." He gave one more deep bow and was gone, closing the door softly behind him. Lan had slouched against the wall through all of this as if half asleep. Now he leapt up and was at the door in 2 long strides. Pressing an ear to a door panel, he listened intently for a slow count of 30, then snatched open the door and stuck his head out into the hall. "They're gone," he said at last, closing the door. "We can talk safely." "I know you say not to trust anyone," Egwene said, "but if you suspect the innkeeper, why stay here?" "I suspect him no more than anyone else," Lan replied. "But then, until we reach Tarvalon, I suspect everyone. There, I'll only suspect half." Rand started to smile, thinking the warder was making a joke. Then he realized there was not a trace of humor on Lan's face. He really would suspect people in Tarvalon. Was anywhere safe? "He exaggerates," Moraine told them soothingly. "Master Fitch is a good man, honest and trustworthy. But he does like to talk, and with the best will in the world, he might let something slip to the wrong ear. And I have never yet stopped in an inn where half the maids did not listen at the doors and spend more time gossiping than making beds. Come, let us be seated before our meal gets cold." They took places around the table, with Moraine at the head and Lan at the foot, and for a while everyone was too busy filling their plates for talk. It might not have been a feast, but after close to a week of flatbread and dried meat, it tasted like one. After a time, Moraine asked, "What did you learn in the common room?" Knives and forks stilled, suspended in midair, and all eyes turned to the warder. "Little that's good," Lan replied. "Avon was right, at least as far as talk has it. There was a battle in Gildon, and Logain was the victor. A dozen different stories are floating about, but they all agree on that." "Logain? That must be the false dragon." It was the first time Rand had heard a name put to the man. Lan sounded almost as if he knew him. "The Aes Sedai?" Moraine asked quietly, and Lan shook his head. "I don't know. Some say they were all killed. Some say none." He snorted. "Some even say they went over to Logain. There's nothing reliable, and I did not care to show too much interest." "Yes," Moraine said, "little that is good." With a deep breath, she brought her attention back to the table. "And what of our own circumstances?" "There, the news is better. No odd happenings, no strangers around who might be Myrddraal, certainly no Trollocs. And the White Cloaks are busy trying to make trouble for Governor Aiden because he won't cooperate with them. They will not even notice us unless we advertise ourselves." "Good," Moraine said. "That agrees with what the bathmaid said. Gossip does have its points. Now," she addressed the entire company, "we have a long journey still ahead of us, but the last week has not been easy either, so I propose to remain here tonight and tomorrow night, and leave early the following morning." All the younger folk grinned. A city for the first time. Moraine smiled, but she still said, "What does Master Andra say to that?" Lan eyed the grinning faces flatly. "Well enough if they remember what I've told them for a change." Tom snorted through his mustaches. "These country folk loose in a..." A city. He snorted again and shook his head. With the crowding at the inn, there were only 3 rooms to be had, 1 for Moraine and Egwene, and 2 to take the men. Rand found himself sharing with Lan and Tom on the 4th floor at the back, close up under the overhanging eaves, with a single small window that overlooked the stable yard. Full night had fallen, and light from the inn made a pool outside. It was a small room to begin with, and an extra bed set up for Tom made it smaller, though all 3 were narrow and hard, Rand found when he threw himself down on his. Definitely not the best room. Tom stayed only long enough to uncase his flute and harp, then left already practicing grand poses. Lan went with him. It was strange, Rand thought as he shifted uncomfortably on the bed. A week ago, he would have been downstairs like a falling rock for just the chance he might see a Gleeman perform, for just the rumor of it. But he had heard Tom tell his stories every night for a week, and Tom would be there tomorrow night and the next, and the hot bath had loosened kinks in his muscles that he had thought would be there forever, and his first hot meal in a week oozed lethargy into him. Sleepily, he wondered if Lan really did know the false dragon Logain. A muffled shout came from below stairs, the common room greeting Tom's arrival, but Rand was already asleep. The stone hallway was dim and shadowy and empty except for Rand. He could not tell where the light came from, what little there was of it. The gray walls were bare of candles or lamps, nothing at all to account for the faint glow that seemed to just be there. The air was still and dank, and somewhere in the distance water dripped with a steady, hollow plonk. Wherever this was, it was not the inn. Frowning, he rubbed at his forehead. Inn? His head hurt, and thoughts were hard to hold on to. There had been something about an inn? It was gone, whatever it was. He licked his lips and wished he had something to drink. He was awfully thirsty, dry as dust thirsty. It was the dripping sound that decided him. With nothing to choose by except his thirst, he started toward that steady plonk, plonk, plonk. The hallway stretched on without any crossing corridor and without the slightest change in appearance. The only features at all were the rough doors set at regular intervals in pairs, one on either side of the hall. The wood splintered and dried despite the damp in the air. The shadows receded ahead of him, staying the same, and the dripping never came any closer. After a long time, he decided to try one of these doors. It opened easily. He stepped through into a grim stone-walled chamber. One wall opened in a series of arches into a gray stone balcony, and beyond that was a sky such as he had never seen. Striated clouds in blacks and grays, reds and oranges, streamed by as if storm winds drove them, weaving and interweaving endlessly. No one could have ever seen a sky like that. It could not exist. He pulled his eyes away from the balcony, but the rest of the room was no better. Odd curves and peculiar angles, as if the chamber had been melted almost haphazardly out of the stone, and columns that seemed to grow out of the gray floor. Flames roared on the hearth like a forge fire with the bellows pumping, but gave no heat. Strange oval stones made the fireplace. They just looked like stones, wet, slick despite the fire, when he looked straight at them. But when he glimpsed them from the corner of his eye, they seemed to be faces instead. The faces of men and women writhing in anguish, screaming silently. The high-backed chairs and the polished table in the middle of the room were perfectly ordinary, but that in itself emphasized the rest. A single mirror hung on the wall, but that was not ordinary at all. When he looked at it, he only saw a blur where his reflection should have been. Everything else in the room was shown true, but not him. A man stood in front of the fireplace. He had not noticed the man when he first came in. If he had not known it was impossible, he would have said no one had been there until he actually looked at the man. Dressed in dark clothes of a fine cut, he seemed in the prime of his maturity, and Rand supposed women would have found him good-looking. Once more we meet face to face, the man said, and just for an instant his mouth and eyes became openings into endless caverns of flame. With a yell, Rand hurled himself backwards out of the room so hard that he stumbled across the hall and banged into the door there, knocking it open. He twisted and grabbed at the door handle to keep from falling to the floor, and found himself staring wide-eyed into a stone room with an impossible sky through the arches leading into a balcony and a fireplace. "You cannot get away from me that easily," the man said. Rand twisted, scrambling back out of the room, trying to regain his feet without slowing down. This time there was no corridor. He froze, half-crouched, not far from the polished table, and looked at the man by the fireplace. It was better than looking at the fireplace stones or at the sky. "This is a dream," he said as he straightened. Behind him he heard the click of the door closing. "It's some kind of nightmare." He shut his eyes, thinking about waking up. When he was a child, the wisdom had said if you could do that in a nightmare, it would go away. The wisdom? What? If only his thoughts would stop sliding away, if only his head would stop hurting, then he could think straight. He opened his eyes again. The room was still as it had been, the balcony, the sky, the man by the fireplace. "Is it a dream?" the man said. "Does it matter?" Once again, for a moment, his mouth and eyes became peepholes into a furnace that seemed to stretch forever. His voice did not change. He did not seem to notice it happening at all. Rand jumped a little this time, but he managed to keep from yelling. "This is a dream. It has to be." All the same, he stepped backwards all the way to the door, never taking his eyes off the fellow by the fire, and tried the handle. It did not move. The door was locked. "You seem thirsty," the man by the fire said. "Drink." On the table was a goblet, shining gold and ornamented with rubies and amethysts. It had not been there before. He wished he could stop jumping. It was only a dream. His mouth felt like dust. "I am, a little," he said, picking up the goblet. The man leaned forward intently, one hand on the back of a chair, watching him. The smell of spiced wine drove home to Rand just how thirsty he was, as if he had had nothing to drink in days. "Have I?" With the wine halfway to his mouth, he stopped. Whispers of smoke were rising from the chair back between the man's fingers, and those eyes watched him so sharply, flickering rapidly in and out of flames. Rand licked his lips and put the wine back on the table, untasted. "I am not as thirsty as I thought." The man straightened abruptly, his face without expression. His disappointment could not have been more plain if he had cursed. Rand wondered what was in the wine. But that was a stupid question, of course. This was all a dream. Then why won't it stop? "What do you want?" he demanded. "Who are you?" Flames rose in the man's eyes and mouth. Rand thought he could hear them roar. "Some call me Baal-Zaman." Rand found himself facing the door, jerking frantically at the handle. All thought of dreams had vanished. The dark one. The door handle would not budge, but he kept twisting. "Are you the one?" Baal-Zaman said suddenly. "You cannot hide it from me forever. You cannot even hide yourself from me. Not on the highest mountain or in the deepest cave. I know you down to the smallest hair." Rand turned to face the man, to face Baal-Zaman. He swallowed hard. A nightmare. He reached back to give the door handle one last pull, then stood up straighter. "Are you expecting glory?" Baal-Zaman said. "Power? Did they tell you the eye of the world would serve you? What glory or power is there for a puppet? The strings that move you have been centuries weaving. Your father was chosen by the White Tower, like a stallion roped and led to his business. Your mother was no more than a broodmare to their plans, and those plans lead to your death. Rand's hands knotted in fists. My father is a good man, and my mother was a good woman. Don't you talk about them. The flames laughed. So there is some spirit in you after all. Perhaps you are the one. Little good it will do you. The Amerlin seat will use you until you are consumed, just as Davian was used, and Urian Stonebow, and Gwaer Amasalan, and Rowlin Darksbane. Just as Loghain is being used until there is nothing left of you. I don't know. Rand swung his head from side to side. That one moment of clear thinking, born in anger, was gone. Even as he groped for it again, he could not remember how he had reached it the first time. His thoughts spun around and around. He seized one like a raft in the whirlpool. He forced the words out, his voice strengthening the further he went. You are bound in Sheol Ghul, you and all the Forsaken, bound by the Creator until the end of time. The end of time? Baalzamon mocked. You live like a beetle under a rock, and you think your slime is the universe. The death of time will bring me power such as you could not dream of, worm. You are bound. Fool, I have never been bound. The fires of his face roared so hot that Rand stepped back, sheltering behind his hands. The sweat on his palms dried from the heat. I stood at Lew Theron Kinslayer's shoulder when he did the deed that named him. It was I who told him to kill his wife, and his children, and all his blood, and every living person who loved him or whom he loved. It was I who gave him the moment of sanity to know what he had done. Have you ever heard a man scream his soul away, worm? He could have struck at me then. He could not have won, but he could have tried. Instead, he called down his precious one power upon himself, so much that the earth split open and reared up Dragonmount to mark his tomb. 1,000 years later, I sent the Trollocs ravening south, and for 3 centuries they savaged the world. Those blind fools in Tar Valon said I was beaten in the end, but the second covenant, the covenant of the 10 nations, was shattered beyond remaking, and who was left to oppose me then? I whispered in Arder Hawkwing's ear, and the length and breadth of the land Aes Sedai died. I whispered again, and the High King sent his armies across the Arath Ocean, across the World Sea, and sealed 2 dooms. The doom of his dream of one land and one people, and a doom yet to come. At his deathbed, I was there when his counselors told him only Aes Sedai could save his life. I spoke, and he ordered his counselors to the stake. I spoke, and the High King's last words were to cry that Tar Valon must be destroyed. When men such as these could not stand against me, what chance do you have, a toad crouching beside a forest petal? You will serve me, or you will dance on Aes Sedai strings until you die, and then you will be mine. The dead belong to me. No, Rand muttered. This is a dream. It is a dream. Do you think you are safe for me in your dreams? Look. Baalzamon pointed commandingly, and Rand's head turned to follow, although he did not turn it. He did not want to turn. The goblet was gone from the table. Where it had been, crouched a large rat, blinking at the light, sniffing the air warily. Baalzamon crooked his finger, and with a squeak the rat arched his back, 4 paws lifting into the air while it balanced awkwardly on its hind feet. The finger curved more, and the rat toppled over, scrabbling frantically, pawing at nothing, squealing shrilly, its back bending, bending. With a sharp snap like the breaking of a twig, the rat trembled violently and was still, lying bent almost double. Rand swallowed. Anything can happen in a dream, he mumbled. Without looking, he swung his fist back against the door again. His hand hurt, but he still did not wake up. Then go to the Aes Sedai. Go to the White Tower and tell them. Tell the Amerlin seed of this dream. The man laughed. Rand felt the heat of the flames on his face. That is one way to escape them. They will not use you then. No, not when they know that I know. But will they let you live to spread the tale of what they do? Are you a big enough fool to believe they will? The ashes of many like you are scattered on the slopes of Dragon Mount. This is a dream, Rand said, panting. It's a dream, and I'm going to wake up. Will you? Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the man's finger move to point at him. Will you indeed? The finger crooked, and Rand screamed as he arched backwards, every muscle in his body forcing him further. Will you ever wake again? Convulsively, Rand jerked up in the darkness, his hands tightening on cloth, a blanket. Pale moonlight shone through the single window, the shadowed shapes of the other two beds. A snore from one of them, like canvas ripping, Tom Marilyn. A few coals gleamed along the ashes on the hearth. It had been a dream then, like that nightmare in the Winespring Inn the day of Beltane. Everything that he had heard and done all jumbled in together with old tales and nonsense from nowhere. He pulled the blanket up around his shoulders, but it was not cold that made him shake. His head hurt too. Perhaps Moraine could do something to stop these dreams. She said she could help with nightmares. With a snort, he lay back. Were the dreams really bad enough for him to ask the help of an Aes Sedai? On the other hand, could anything he did now get him in any deeper? He had left the two rivers, come away with an Aes Sedai, but there had not been any choice, of course. So did he have any choice but to trust her? An Aes Sedai? It was as bad as the dreams, thinking about it. He huddled under his blanket, trying to find the calmness of the void, the way Tam had taught him, but sleep was a long time returning. Now remember, what we learned today is that Matt cannot keep his mouth shut to save his life, and that Balsamon is a really scary guy. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. If you did enjoy yourself, please consider joining our community over at Leaves of the Wheel on Instagram. We would love to have you.